All right, here we are, continuing on with Lehi in the desert. Last time we had learned that according to certain phrases that are in the Book of Mormon, that it actually helps support the idea that it is in fact a true and proper book by the authors that say that they are the author, such as Nephi. Especially the phrase, I know I focused on the one that was in the land of Jerusalem, because that was brought up on my mission and how that actually speaks to its truthfulness, not fraud. Which is really funny because they're like, see, he got it wrong. And it's like, are you serious? You understand that this was that line of reasoning was debunked in 1953. That is how old their argument is, if not older. Anyway, so we're talking about the language of the Book of Mormon. All right, there we go. The world has always cast a superior and mocking eye in the inordinate concern of the Book of Mormon for things Egyptian. That's the other thing, is all the culture and stuff around the Jerusalem being more economically aligned with the Egyptians. Sorry, I'm sitting here thinking about China and the United States, and so I'm like, yeah, the Egyptians. Sorry. The world has always cast a superior and mocking eye on the inordinate concern of the Book of Mormon for things Egyptian. With surprise and incredulity, it is now learning that the Egyptian culture counted for far more in Palestine in 600 BC than anyone had ever supposed. It is significant that the Book of Mormon concern with Egypt is strictly cultural. It never mentions Pharaoh or speaks of Egyptian government, but only of Egyptian culture and especially language. It makes it perfectly clear, however, that Egyptian was for Lehi a second language, for having been taught in the language of the Egyptians. Therefore, he could read these engravings and teach them to his children. Moses 1:4. We have, Mosiah 1:4, I guess. We have seen that the Egyptian was taught to Ethiopians, Syrians, and all other foreigners in Lehi's day. Mormon tells us in Mormon 9:32 through 23, that the language of Lehi's descendants was not Hebrew or Egyptian, but a mixture of both being corrupted in the process, so that none other people knoweth our language, which would certainly not have been the case had they spoken only Hebrew. Ancient Hittite was just such a dual language. The reason none other people knoweth our language today is that English is the result of imposing cultivated French on native Saxon, just as cultivated Egyptian was imposed on native Hebrew in Lehi's Palestine. On the ceremonial dagger, which was its handle of white gold, reminds us of Laban's sword. We read the name Jacoaherm, or Java is satisfied. Chava is satisfied, a name which neatly combines Egyptian and Hebrew in the process of fusion, for which a great deal of evidence now exists, and which has been in progress long before Lehi's day. There are references. It was common in ancient, as in modern languages, to use one and the same word, e.g. English speech, Egypt Ra, for both utterance and language, though this common Book of Mormon usage is not found in Hebrew. When Nephi says, "After this manner was the language of my father in praising of his God," 1 Nephi 1:15, he is not telling us what language his father spoke, but giving notice that he is quoting or paraphrasing an actual speech of his father. Likewise, when he says, "I make a record in the language of my father," he says that he's going to quote or paraphrase a record actually written by his father. He explains that his father wrote the record in Egyptian, though it dealt with Jewish matters, but he never affirms that Egyptian was his father's native tongue. The clause in 1 Nephi 1:2, which consists of, does not refer back to language or father, of course, but to record. The other two are syntactically possible, but don't make sense. A language does not consist of a language. A language does not consist of a language, but a record does. The sentence is awkward English, but like many others in the Book of Mormon, closely resembles the familiar Semitic hull construction, and could be read, I make a record in the language of my father consisting of the learning of the Jews, etc. Joseph Smith did not dictate the punctuation of the Book of Mormon. Some have maintained that the Book of Mormon was written in Hebrew, but with Egyptian characters. But Mormon, in 9:32 through 34, observes that the Nephites have altered their writing of Egyptian to conform to their way of speaking it, and that the Hebrew hath been altered by us also, with the result that none other people knoweth our language. Their language was neither Egyptian nor Hebrew. Mormon appreciates the accuracy and clarity of Old Hebrew, which is no longer spoken by his people, and writes reluctantly in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian, simply because that takes up less space. Now, Egyptian could be written in less space than Hebrew, because in Lehi's day, Demotic was actually a shorthand, extremely cramped and abbreviated. It was shorthand for the very reason that it was thoroughly idiomatic, that is, peculiarly adapted to the sound and thought process of one language, and one language only. It could be used very economically for writing Egyptian, but not for any other language. In fact, not long after Lehi's time in the Persian conquerors of Egypt learned Aramaic instead of Egyptian, because the Egyptian script was too clumsy and hard to learn. Now we are asked to believe that the Jews reversed this process and adopted Egyptian characters for their own language. This amounts to a declaration that the Nephites denied themselves the use of their holy and superbly practical script, of which Torseisner writes, the script of Lachish makes us realize for the first time that the Phoenician Hebrew alphabet is a script invented and used particularly for writing in ink upon papyrus, hide parchment, and potsherds. We now realize that the ancient Jews could write quickly and boldly in an artistic flowing hand with the loving penmanship of those who enjoy writing. And the Nephites got rid of this to learn in its place the most awkward, difficult, and impractical system of writing ever devised by man? Why all the trouble? Simply to save space. What space? Space on valuable plates. When did the custom begin? With Lehi. Where and when did he learn the language of the Egyptians? In Palestine, of course, before he ever thought of himself as a record keeper. Did the wealthy Lehi learn Egyptian characters so that he could sit in his house in the land of Jerusalem, and by writing Hebrew with demotic symbols, save a few cents a month on writing materials? And did he command his sons to learn Egyptian so that they could save space when they kept records? Of course not. When they learned the language, neither Lehi nor his sons had any idea that someday it would be useful to keepers of records on metal plates. They had no other reason for learning Egyptian characters than to read and write Egyptian. It was only later, when historians became cramped for space, that they saw the advantage of continuing to write in Egyptian. And the Egyptian characters can only have been preserved for their use because the language was also preserved. For people who were not crowded for space would not have continued to write Hebrew in the difficult Egyptian characters for hundreds of years, when, when all the time they might just as well have been writing in the 22 simple and practical characters of the Hebrew alphabet. Many reasons might be added for rejecting this interesting theory. But the simple statement of Mormon should be enough to banish the darling illusion that anyone who has had elementary Hebrew knows the original language of the Book of Mormon. If that were so, its translation by the gift and power of God would have been no great miracle, and instead of a Urim and Thummim, a short list of Egyptian characters with their Hebrew equivalents would have been the only tool necessary to Joseph Smith's generation, or our own. The fact remains that the abridging and editing of the Book of Mormon was in a language known to no other people on earth but the Nephites. There is much in Nephi's writing to show that as he claims he is writing in Egyptian, not merely in Egyptian characters, when Nephi tells us that his record and that of his father are in the language of the Egyptians, not that the language of his father was in the language of Egyptians, we can be sure he means just that. And what could be more natural than that he should choose to record his message addressed not only to the Jews, but also to all the house of Israel, 1 Nephi 19:19, and all the Gentiles, 1 Nephi 13:39-40, in a world language rather than in his own tribal Hebrew. Did not later Jews adopt Greek, an international world language, in preference to Hebrew, even as a vehicle of Holy Writ, for the purpose of commanding the widest possible hearing, not only among the Gentiles, but also among the Jews themselves? The first 3 verses of 1 Nephi, sharply set off from the rest of the text, are a typical colophon, a literary device that is highly characteristic of Egyptian compositions. Oh, really? Typical is the famous Bremerinde papyrus, which opens with a colophon containing 1, the date, 2, the titles of Nassim, the author, 3, the names of his parents, and a word in praise of their virtues, with special mentioning of his father's prophetic calling, 4, a curse against anyone who might take away the book, probably due to fear lest a sacred book should get into impure hands. And compare this with Nephi's colophon, his name, the merits of his parents, with special attention to the learning of his father, a solemn avowal, a solemn avowal corresponding to Nassim's curse, that the record is true, and the assertion, I make it with mine own hand, an indispensable condition of every true colophon, since the purpose of a colophon is to establish the identity of the actual writer, not merely the ultimate author of the text. Egyptian literary writings regularly close with this formula, IWFPW. So if pua, thus it is. And so it is. Nephi ends the main section of his book with the phrase, and thus it is, amen. Ooh, interesting. So here you can see the colophon is another literary example that shows that he was writing in an although he had Hebrew language, he was taught how to write in Egyptian, and he was using the proper form from Egyptian colophons to start the Book of Mormon. The great preoccupation and concern displayed in the Book of Mormon for matters in writing, Lehi's passion for writing everything down, and the obvious pride of writers in their skill are peculiarly Egyptian. Nephi's I make it with my own hand is simply the Egyptian written with my own fingers, and we can almost hear Nephi speaking in the words of an Egyptian sage, copy thy fathers who have gone before thee. Behold, their words are recorded in writing. Open and read and copy. Certainly Nephi himself was diligent in keeping this seboyet. It was the Egyptian, not the Hebrew gentleman, who advertised his proficiency in the arts of the scribe. Thoroughly Egyptian also is Lehi's didactic spirit, and his habit of giving long formal addresses on moral and religious subjects in the manner of the fathers to his sons. Like a good Egyptian, he wrote all this down, of course. The form of these discourses, with their set introductions and formal imagery, might have come right out of an Egyptian schoolroom, though their content smacks more of the learning of the Jews, as the Nephi himself observes. Both in form and content, however, the writings of the prophets and the wisdom of Israel are found to resemble the prophetic and wisdom literature of Egypt very closely. Let me check some of the footnotes here. Teaching of Amenephis is addressed for his... So, like a good Egyptian, he wrote this all down, of course. There's a footnote that says, the teaching of Amenephis is addressed for his son, the youngest of his children, little compared to his relations. Then follows a long text presenting a number of surprising parallels to the book of Proverbs, and a remarkable one to Psalms 1, the righteous man being compared to a fruitful tree. Compare this with 2 Nephi 2 and 3, and Lehi's description of the fruit as white is a typical Egyptianism. Interesting. Well, how should I help you? She's just going to crawl off your back. That's what you get. Leave the kitties alone.
Hey, right. No, was on the desk, and so I had to bring her off. So.
I appreciate that. All right, now I've got cats at my feet. If you hear me shout out in pain, it's because they're grabbing onto my legs. Oh, that's my leg. What you think you're doing down there? All right. Here we go. What are you munching? My cat's like eating my sandals. I never, you sit there and think, well, at least cats won't chew on my shoes. No, my cats, my bush cats, chew on my shoes. What are you munching on? That's my sandal. You little troublemakers are having too much fun, I can tell. All right, let's actually continue with how the Egyptian is. Don't you bite my ankle, you little ankle biter. Yeah, that's my arm. Anyway. Sorry. Let's see here. Learning of the Jews. Let me see. Both in form and content, however, the writings of the prophets and the wisdom of Israel are found to resemble the prophetic and wisdom literature of Egypt very closely. So that we need not be surprised if Lehi's prophecies do the same. At the end of the last century, scholars were mystified to find that a demotic prophecy, datable to the time of Bocharis, which is 718 to 712 BC, in which coming destructions were predicted with the promise of a Messiah to follow, was put in the mouth of the Lamb, Pahib. Greek sources inform us that this prophecy enjoyed very great circulation in ancient times. The strange wording of Lehi's great prophecy, uttered by the Lamb, is thus seen to be no anachronism taken from Hellenistic or Christian times, as once maintained. Well, you guys are just fascinating with my ankles, aren't you? Okay, I'm going to have to... Hopefully I don't run over their tails as I move up. I'm going to have to switch how I sit so they don't grab at my legs. All right, watch yourselves. There. Now I've got my feet off the ground. Now I need to get that off the ground. Okay. Well, that is interesting. I did not know about this prophecy at the time of Bocharis, which talked about a Messiah, and... All right, typical of the Egyptian prophets is one Neferohu, whose prophecies, though of uncertain date, were credited with great antiquity. This man describes himself as a commoner, but a valiant man, and a wealthy man of great possessions, and he is proud of his skill as a scribe, like Lehi, in other things. He recalls also that he brooded much over what should come to pass in the land, and having done so was moved to prophesy. Up, my heart, and bewail this land whence thou art sprung. The land is utterly perished, and naught remains. The earth is fallen into misery for thy sake, of yon food, of the Bedouins who pervade the land. Yet he looks forward to a Savior King who is to come. The situation is not unique, but is characteristic of one both in Egypt and Judah. And no one could deny that if Lehi was not a fact, he was at least a very authentic type. Nephi says his father was but one among many prophets in his own day. Egyptian politics in the New World. The best possible indication of the influence of Egyptian civilization on Lehi's people may be found in an episode taken from the latter history of the Nephites, Book of Mormon. Acting on the recommendation of King Mosiah, who was anxious to avoid a throne controversy, the Nephites in the early 1st century BC substituted for kingship a system of rule by priestly judges. Wise men to be judges that will judge this people according to the commandments of God. Mosiah 29:11. We are not told where Mosiah got the idea, but the eagerness and ease with which the people adopted the system imply that they were familiar with it. This is definitely indicated by the account of one Korihor who was able to gain a great following in the land by charging the high priest and also the chief judge over the land with reviving ordinances and performances which are laid down by ancient priests to usurp power and authority over the country. That's Alma 30, 21 through 24. That there was a real danger of reviving an ancient priest rule is apparent from the fact that the new system had no sooner been established than a certain Nahor, in the first case, to be tried by the new chief judge, is charged with being first to introduce priestcraft among this people. The chief judge on this occasion observes that such priestcraft is allowed by the people would prove their entire destruction. Alma 1:12. So we are told that priestcraft has not been practiced in the New World, but that a tradition of priestcraft was vividly remembered. Its origins must therefore be sought in the Old World, and if we would believe the Book of Mormon. Yes, it's a cute kitty. From the Old World. Now, this is an interesting thing because, I'm glad we're about to go read the Old Testament again. Because if Lehi came from the Josian reforms, I would think that he would have had, his judges before Josiah, or not, kings. Because I'm wondering if, I always assumed that the Book of Mormon getting their judges would have come from the idea of judges in the Old Testament. And so, what if it's not? Because I suspect he's about to say that. Because we've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, and then Kings. So, if Samuel and Kings was during the Josian reforms, is Judges before and after Josiah? Let us see. Is the book of Judges happening after the reign of King Josiah? No, the book of Judges is not set after the King Josiah. Before the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. So death of Joshua to the time of King Saul. So, they would have... I've always assumed that judges in the Book of Mormon would have come from the concept of judges that Israel had as they exited Egypt. But let's see what Hugh Nibley has to say. I know he's a bit smarter than me in a bunch of things. So, the old world. Now, I have to admit, so the idea of judges may have come from the Israel judges, but Hugh Nibley is specifically talking about priestcraft and that destroying the people. So let's see what he has to say. From the 11th dynasty on the history of Egypt is largely concerned with the efforts of the priests of Ammon, with the chief priest of Ammon at their head, to gain control of the country. About 1085 BC, the chief priest of Ammon actually seized the throne of the south, and from that time on, the high priest of Ammon could and constantly did reduce the king to a position of subservience. The name of the great priest who crowned himself in Thebes was Herihor or Kerihor. Okay. Wait a minute. This is interesting. Okay. The Herihor, or Kerihor, comes from E.A.W. Budge calls it Herihor, the Mummy, Cambridge 1925, page 103. Against this earlier reading, Herihuru, read by and Herihor by Bested. Following the most recent study of that Morit called Herihor. Kerihor. Oh my gosh. So, the name Korihor that we have in the Book of Mormon might be this Egyptian Kerihor. Korihor. Wow, the great priests who crowned themselves in Thebes. So either this guy was naming himself after this Egyptian priest who took over, or they gave him that title afterwards. Wow, that's insanely cool. Okay, I don't know if Jonah Barnes is still. I'm not reading one of his books, but if he is reading, I'm just saying, this is Lehi in the Desert, page 21, from the Old World. We want to look into that. That's pretty dang cool. Wow. All right. The cornerstone of the priestly rule was a new system of popular law courts in which the priests of Ammon were the judges, and which at first competed with and then supplanted the regular courts everywhere. Ooh. Competed with. Wow. The separatist tendency, which remains characteristic of the priestly history, may have been foreshadowed in the uniting of all the South countries as a single administrative unit under Nephi, the great governor of the 18th dynasty. Or sorry, not Nephi, Nehi, Nehi. This is Egyptian stuff, not Book of Mormon stuff. So they may have foreshadowed this uniting of the South countries in a single administration under Nehi, a great governor of the 18th dynasty, as well as in the appearance beginning with the court of Nehiri, of a separate ruling family at Thebes under the patronage of Ammon, or Ammon, A-M-O-N. So, Ammon, I wish I knew which it was supposed to be, but oh well. Nehiri's successor, by taking the same name, Samtawi, uniter of the land, serves notice of a new dynasty. Whether or not Nehi, Nehiri are in any way related to the name Nephi, there are other Egyptian names that come nearer, remains to be investigated, but no philologist will refuse to acknowledge the possible identity of Book of Mormon Korihor with the Egyptian Kerihor. And none may deny, philologist or not, the close resemblance between Sam and Sam, the brother of Nephi. So, dude, this is cool stuff. The so-called people of Ammon with 2 M's that we're used to from the Book of Mormon, a community noted for its piety took Korihor before their leader, Ammon, who was high priest over the people. Thence he was carried before the high priest and also the chief judge of the land. This higher court, in turn, sent him to the land of Zarahemla, to Alma, the chief judge, who was governor over all the land, as well as head of the church. See Alma 30, 19 through 21. In the Old World, the chief governor of Egypt was the high priest, or Amon, or Ammon. This title being in Egyptian Neterhemtep, chief servant, Hem, of the god. The same as extremely common Abdi element in Western Asiatic names of the time, cf. the modern Arabic Abdullah, servant of God, is the most interesting that the brother of the earlier Ammon in the Book of Mormon actually bears the name of Hem. See Mosiah 7:6. As for Amon, or Ammon, it is commonest proper name in the Book of Mormon, and also the commonest and most revered name in Egyptian Empire, which at all times during the later period after 930 BC pretends to embrace Palestine in regard Jerusalem as a dependent. The reverence shown the name of Ammon in no way indicates the slightest concession to paganism on the part of the Jews, since Ammon is no less than the Egyptian version of their own universal one creator God, the Great Spirit, who is never conceived to be in animal form, nor represented by any image. He first appears about 2140 BC in southern Egypt at Thebes, where he seems to have been an importation from Western Asia. Really? Okay, so let me reread that. So Ammon is the Egyptian equivalent of the creator god. But they did not put him into any animal or representative as any animal, that kind of thing. Okay. He was never conceived as an animal. He first appears, so Ammon, I suppose, so he's talking about, first appears about 2140 BC in southern Egypt at Thebes, where he seems to have been an importation from Western Asia. Can he be the God of Abraham? It is significant that the name first rises to prominence in the years following the time of Abraham's sojourn in Egypt, and near a place where the most famous Jewish colony in Egypt was later located. A reflection of the Egyptian picture may be detected in the coast cities of Palestine, regularly under Egyptian influence, where government was also by priests and judges who occasionally usurped the office of king. This happened both at Sidon and Tyre. In the latter city, 2 priestly usurpers bore the name of Maitena or Matena, a name which has a number of variants and strongly suggests the Book of Mormon Mathoni, the Book of Mormon. The experiment with government by priestly judges collapsed largely due to a rivalry for chief judgeship among 3 candidates, all sons of the great chief judge, Pahoran. Their names are Pahoran Peanchi and Pesumeni, or as I like to say it, Pahoran Peanchi and Pachumeni. But there's actually a description guide at the back of the Book of Mormon, and I think it's Pesumeni. In the Old World, well, such family rivalry for the office of high priest is characteristic of the Egyptian system, in which the office seems to have been hereditary, not by law, but by usage. The name Pahoran reflects the Palestinian Pahura for Pahran, Pahari, the Syrian, which is Reformed Egyptian, i.e., a true Egyptian title, but altered in such a way as to adapt it to the Canaanite speech. Pahura, also written Puhuru, Paharu or Puhuru, it's all U's, was in Amarna times an Egyptian governor, Rabu of Syria. The same man, or another man with the same name, was placed by Pharaoh as governor of the Ube district, with his headquarters at Kumedi, either Kumedi or Kumedi. Hard I, soft I, I'm not sure. The element Kumen in the Book of Mormon place names, like Kishkumen. Oh, interesting. All right. Yeah, I gotta put my legs down now that the kittens are no longer attacking him. So, okay, so right now he's shooting me with a fire hose of names and suffixes, some that have to do with the name of Pohorin, Panchi, and Pakumene, and Kumedi, and Kumen, and there was like Kishkumen. Sorry. Wow. I always thought of these as sounding like native names, but apparently this is very much Egyptian type names. Peanchi is simply the well-known Egyptian Peanki. Peank, also rendered Peanki or Peank, etc. The first important man to bear the name was none other than the son of the above-mentioned Kerihor, the Egyptian one. He did not succeed his father on the throne, being content with the all-powerful office of chief high priest of Ammon, but his son Panezium did become king. In the middle of the 8th century, another Peaniki, a king of Nubia, conquered virtually all of Egypt and claimed for himself the office of high priest of Ammon at Thebes, as well as the title of Pharaoh. His successor, when the Assyrians invaded Egypt in the days of Lehi, fled to a fortified city, as yet unlocated, which bore the name of Kipkip, or Kibkib, a name form that strongly suggests the Book of Mormon's city name Gidgidoni. Also, Gimno. Oh, interesting. Holy cow. So the Book of Mormon is a lot more Egyptian than I thought. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm wondering if a lot of this information was in the Book of Lehi that we don't have because it was lost. The first half of the Book of Mormon. Wow. Pesumeni, or Pakumeni, the name of the third son, resembles that borne by some of the last priest governors of Egypt, whose names are rendered Pamenech, Pamunk, Pamenches, etc. The Greeks, who often furnish the key to correct reading of Egyptian names, put the guttural before the nasal, Pakomios. The most famous man in the name commanded all the forces of the south and was also high priest of Horus. At least one other governor general of Egypt bore the name. A striking coincidence is the predominance among both Egyptian and Nephite judge names of the prefix pa. Yeah, I noticed that. Like, it was out of the blue. You have all these names in the Book of Mormon. Then you get this section of judges, and they start with pa all of a sudden, like Peanchi, Pakmene, Pahoran, all that, and more after that point when they started having judges. Dude, this book is changing how I'm going to read the Book of Mormon. Okay, so let's see what he has to say. In late Egyptian, this extremely common, so the Nephite names with the prefix pa. In late Egyptian, this is extremely common and has simply the force of the definite article. Another Book of Mormon judge, Sizoram, has a name that suggests that of an Egyptian governor of a Syrian city, Chiziri. It should be noted that the above Panazem, upon becoming a king, took the name of Miriamon, which has the Book of Mormon ring, even if we don't read it. Moriaman or Morianton is how we would say it. A perfectly possible variant. Sidon was the official port through which the Jews traded with Egypt. Oh my gosh! There is so many names that are this Egyptian. Interesting. Egyptian Hebrew. Sidon was the official port through which the Jews traded with Egypt. Since Lehi and his people were in the mercantile business, it is not surprising that Sidon is the only Palestinian city besides Jerusalem whose name figures prominently in the Book of Mormon geography. Moreover, since Sidon was the common meeting ground between Hebrew and Egyptian, and since names in both languages occur in the Book of Mormon, one would expect the name of this most popular place to appear in its Egyptian as well as in its Hebrew form. The Egyptian form, Albright's lists, the 22nd before, is Jidwana, Djiwana, Jidwana. Oh, okay. Jidwana, which is remarkably close to the Book of Mormon personal name, Gidona. Gidwana. Do you see how that comes together? We cannot conclude this brief survey of the Egyptian question without reference to one significant indication that Lehi's forefathers were not natives of Jerusalem. We learn in Mosiah 1:4 that certain plates were written in the language of the Egyptians. Nephi informs us in 1 Nephi 3:19 that these same plates were in the language of our fathers, and that the possession of them was necessary of a knowledge a knowledge of that language was to be preserved among his people. To preserve the mere characters, but a single page of Hebrew and Egyptian signs would have been necessary, and Lehi or his sons could have produced such from memory, since they had already been taught them. And if the language in question were Hebrew, Lehi's children could have produced from their own resources any number of books in their own language, so that when Nephi expresses his belief that without that one volume of plates a language will be lost, the ancient language of his fathers, he cannot possibly be speaking of Hebrew. The preservation of Hebrew would naturally require possession of the scriptures, the canon of the pure language. But these could be had anywhere in Judah and would not require the dangerous mission to Laban. The language of Lehi's forefathers was a foreign language, and when Nephi tells us it was the language of the Egyptians, he means what he says. Since time immemorial, Israelites had been sojourning in Egypt individually and in groups, and there is nothing the least surprising in the possibility that Lehi's ancestors were among such settlers. Wow. Next is Men of the East, which is chapter 2. This is incredible. Wow. Okay. So, these priestly names of priest judges starting with Pa and having to do with similar events that happened just before and as Lehi was leaving. Many of the names that were used in the Book of Mormon corresponding to popular names that would have come from the time when Lehi was leaving. Sidon being the name both as the main port in Judea and here in the Americas, the River Sidon. Jeez Louise. Holy crap. Yeah, yeah, and I can see why. Oof, Don Bradley and his stuff on the Lost 116 pages talking about Nephi trying to establish all sorts of things, both politically and spiritually, about how for Nephi it was his own exodus to his own promised land, and that it was a specifically the branch of Joseph that was being cut off, and Joseph being very steeped in Egyptian culture. Jeez Louise. Wow, sorry, between these recent scholars and these old ones of Hugh Nibley, wow. Just wow. I am flabbergasted at how amazing it all comes together. Obviously, this isn't as spiritually deep and significant, because right now we're just showing all the tidbits and reviews of, look, in the text itself, we can see how this all relates back to Lehi's time in Jerusalem that was culturally a part of Egypt, culturally subservient to it. And, you know, I look at these other books I've been reading, The Lost Gems of Genesis and Key to the Keystone and In the Language of Adam. And all of them have very deep spiritual significance to me because in many ways they're teaching me to look at the symbols that have been given and pattern my life after the symbology that God has given to follow him. So, although Hugh Nibley is pounding out all this information about names and other things and showing how it's technically accurate in Egyptian, it does give me a greater depth of understanding of the Book of Mormon and why there's these changes in it that I've noticed, but I have no clue why. It's answers to questions I never knew to ask, but have noticed, which is cool. I hope it's doing the same for you as it does for me. And I hope it brings to mind that, more than anything else, that we should take seriously how God wants to love and guide and direct us in our own individual lives. For some people, these tidbits are extremely important. For other people, for myself, I know the spiritual tidbits are super important. The ones that say, well, actually, all of it's kind of runs together. It shows how God worked with his children throughout time. And he loves you, and he wants the best for you. He wants you to come to him. So, and I want to leave on that spiritual note, more than anything. All these tidbits that really show how it all worked together. Super cool. Super, super cool. But how should we govern ourselves as people because of this? Well, preserve the language of our fathers. Preserve the traditions of our fathers. We live in a world that is drowned by content. People spewing whatever and however constantly all the time. Most of it brain-numbing. I mean, there was a joke on the internet where they basically said, come on now. You're looking up expectantly. Come here. There we go. So, there was a joke on the internet that brain rot has become so pervasive, especially among short form videos and such, that just watching a TV show or a movie feels productive. That's how addicted we got to our phones. When I sit here and go, it feels like I'm relaxing and doing something good watching a show because it actually has writing arc and storytelling ability in it. That is how much trash is being shoveled to us. So, hopefully, these little tidbits and these little arcs are markers of progression in your own life, learning in your own life. And I hope it makes your day brighter. And I hope that it brightens your testimony of Jesus Christ and how God has worked with his children all over the world to bring them the good news of the atonement so that we can return back to him. May God be with you.